डॉक्टर बाबा साहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Namaskar. I Jayjit Trivedi welcome all of you from the Chaitanya studio located at Jyotirmay campus of the Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar Open University, Ahmedabad. Today we are going to discuss paper number 2 of the MAJMC course. The name of the paper is Understanding Media, Mass Communication and Journalism. Remember, we are discussing Unit 2 of the paper and this is part 4th of the same unit. Now, let us discuss. We are at the section 2, the birth of journalism 2. Now, let us discuss what we have already discussed earlier, right. We have discussed beginning of journalism in 17th century, how journalism started in 17th century, earlier days of journalism. We have already discussed different printing press, that is steam printing and electrical printing press. We have already discussed vertical and horizontal expansion of newspapers, wherein we have discussed that increasing number of copies is vertical expansion and increasing number of subjects, that is niche, is horizontal expansion of the newspaper. We have already discussed the establishment of news agencies and professionalism of starting of professionalism in journalism field. And we have already discussed how the first journalism university was started and how the journalists became more and more professional towards their duties. Now, today we will discuss beginning of journalism in India. We have discussed till today how in the world the journalism was beginning. Today we will be discussing how journalism began in India. Indian journalism was frame had observed many phases, and as the early stage it was influenced and run by outsiders or Anglo-Indian people. Now, what do we mean by Anglo-Indian, Anglo people? Anglo people is more or less English people. We all know that for more than 200 years Britishers ruled India, and that was the time during which technology advancement was happening, and this technology was also introduced in India. So, because of this technological advancement, journalism also started working as mode of information for people. But we should know that the Anglo people or English people were the pioneers of the journalism field in India, as Indians too were working with them and readers were Indians and British both. This area is termed as Anglo-Indian era, right. Now, when Britishers were ruling India, what do you think? How many peoples would be literate? How many peoples would be know how to read? And mind it, we also have seen that the newspapers were mostly run by English people. So, what do you think? What would be the language of these newspapers? Obviously, it would be English, right. So, English newspaper, how many Indians would be able to read those newspapers, right? The number would be very low compared to the population of India. So, what we can see is that this era is called Anglo-Indian era. Why? Because the journalists were from English background and some of them were Indians, and readers also were from English background and very few readers were from India, right. That is why it is called Anglo-Indian era of journalism, right. This was followed by the Indians launching English newspapers again English newspapers only, right, including newspapers like Bengal Gazette, The Hindu, The Indian Express, The Hindustan Times and Amrita Bazar Patrika, right. So, what we can see here is that in the early days of journalism in India, newspapers were predominantly published in English by the British. Then Indians started some of the newspapers, but they also worked in English language only because of the readers, right. We should know the demand supply law here, where demand would be obviously for English newspapers. So, supply was also of English newspapers. These are names which one must remember, one must know that these are the earlier newspapers. I will repeat the names: Bengal Gazette, The Hindu, The Indian Express, The Hindustan Times and Amrita Bazar Patrika. Now, your work is to comment how many newspapers from this list are still running and do you read those newspapers or not. Now, let us look at how it started and how it grew. In the early days, almost all the newspapers were launched by foreigners. We discussed earlier, mostly Britishers who had majorly settled in big cities like Kolkata, Mumbai and Madras. Right. Now, we should know that Britishers were ruling India. Where would they stay? They would stay at the big cities only. So, the reader would be in the big cities only. That is why the journals or the newspaper in earlier days were printing from these big cities only. They were not available in smaller cities, towns or villages. Like the first English newspaper to be launched in 1780 from Calcutta, now we can say Kolkata, was James Augustus Hickey's Bengal Gazette, right. Bengal Gazette from James Augustus Hickey in 1780 is termed as first newspaper published from India by a Britisher, James Augustus Hickey. Now, we should know an interesting story behind it, that Hickey's journal, Bengal Gazette, there are several names of this newspaper as well. One is Hickey's Journal, one is Hickey's Gazette, other is Bengal Gazette. These are all different names by which this newspaper was known. We should know that James Augustus Hickey started this newspaper in rebellion from the British government. He wanted to write about the corruption happening during that time, and that is why he started this newspaper, right. And interestingly, the British government did not like it and they jailed and imprisoned James Augustus Hickey for writing against the British government. And which company was ruling India then? Write that name of the company in the comment box. So, what they did? They imprisoned James Augustus Hickey and also they started one newspaper that became second newspaper of India, that is Indian Gazette, right. So, that was pro British government. This newspaper was also started by Britishers. Journalists and educated people from Britain were the ones who observed and then tapped the newspaper market, right. So, we have already discussed that journalists were also British and the readers were also British in earlier times in Indian journalism. Now, these names you must be knowing because you are student of journalism. Now, Robert Knight and T.J. Bennett and F.N. Coleman started. These were the founding editors of the Times of India in the 19th century. That is why the company which publishes Times of India today is known as Bennett Coleman Company. The name came from Bennett and Coleman, right. So, that is why it is termed as the Bennett Coleman Company, which publishes the Times of India. Later, Coleman was also the editor of the Statesman. Initially, community gossip was primarily published in these newspapers in order to attract readers, along with other developments, scandals, and later to the editor by local and rural readers. So, initially what was the form of journalism in India? Initially it was mainly for gossip, right. Till today we can see the newspapers still write and publish about gossip, because we all like to know what is happening in others' life, right. That is also a part of news which attracted many readers during those times. One more peculiar thing here to be noted is letters to the editor by local people, local readers, right. This is a very good form of journalism where people write to the editor about their questions, about the happenings, about their problems, and they are given platform so that the people who are in the power could read and know what are the issues in people at large. During those days, also editorials were written by the editor sharing their opinion on current topics, right. Do you see editor page today also in the newspapers? Tell me, have you read any of the editorials recently which are based on current topics? It is a practice which started back then and running still today. The trend did not end here. Even freedom fighters like Mahatma Gandhi, Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, Bal Gangadhar Tilak had launched their newspapers as well. Now remember, to be a better leader or better communicator, in those times this was the most advanced technology to reach to the masses, right. So, how they became big leaders? They started their newspapers, they started communicating with people. Through these newspapers they communicated, and then that is how they became great leaders of the nation. People followed them. Now, let us look what were the newspapers or journals started by these stalwarts. Mahatma Gandhi started Indian Opinion, Young India, Navjivan and Harijan. These are 4 newspapers or journals which were started by Mahatma Gandhi. Motilal Nehru started the Independent, Jawaharlal Nehru started National Herald, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak started Kesari and Maratha. Kesari and Maratha. Remember, all these newspapers, most of them were in English, and later on they became in vernacular language as well. We can say Kesari was also a Indian language newspaper, Harijan, Navjivan, these all were Hindi or Indian language newspapers. The trend was followed by the regional or Indian languages newspapers. Now, earlier what used to happen? Because the journalists were Britishers, the readers also were Britishers. That is why the newspapers were English, in English language. But as the time passed, as more and more people became more and more educated, the demand for local language newspaper arose, and that is how Indian language newspapers were started. First Indian language daily newspaper was launched in Mumbai in the Gujarati language, that was named as Mumbai Samachar. Now remember the word here, daily. This was a daily newspaper. Before this, many local language newspapers were published, but they were periodicals. They would be fortnightly, weekly, etc. But Mumbai Samachar was the first newspaper which was published in Indian language, that is Gujarati, and that was published daily. One should remember that this newspaper is still running and still it has a great circulation in Mumbai and Gujarati dominated area. Even missionaries did not lag behind and they launched Digdarshan newspaper, which means World Vision, in early 1800s. The second Bengali newspaper was Samachar Darpan. This was also started. Now, what we can see here is that Bengal was predominantly an epicenter for newspapers. How? Because most of the cultural happenings happened in Bengal only. So, that is why newspapers also first started in Bengal and then slowly they spread in the entire country. Here also Gujarati and Mumbai. Mumbai also we have learned that most of the Britishers or the learned people or elite class was staying in bigger cities. So, during those times Calcutta, Mumbai, Chennai, these were the bigger cities and cultural hubs. That is why newspapers started there firstly and then spread to the entire nation. During the early days, journalism was not welcomed by the British, especially the East India Company in India. We have already learnt what happened to James Augustus Hickey. He started this newspaper Bengal Gazette in rebellion to British government only, and British government did not like it. That continued for all the newspapers that came later. We should know that the vernacular language newspapers during those times were publishing some of the news which was against the British government, right, because the freedom fighting already had begun. So, these newspapers were publishing the news or making people aware about the freedom of India. So, that is why the British government had to come up with the Censorship Act in 1799, wherein they would impose censorship on newspapers, they would imply some taxes on newspapers. So, that became a very big hurdle for journalism in those times. Then it is alleged that the act was introduced during the basic objective to ensure that the French do not report against the British, which could damage the reputation or image of the latter. We can see that during those times not only Britishers were ruling India, some of the part of Indian geography was ruled by the French, some of the part was also ruled by the Portuguese. These three major races were controlling Indian subcontinent. So, but the Britishers were the most powerful among them. Britishers made this rule so that there are no criticism of British governments in the newspapers whatsoever. Gradually, newspapers, magazines, books and all printed publications were covered under this act. Then the Vernacular Press Act was also introduced in 1878 by Lord Lytton. Lord Lytton imposed Vernacular Press Act, which was only focusing on the local or regional languages newspapers, right. So, what happened? As we discussed, these regional language newspapers were publishing against the British government in their newspapers, and the government did not want that people would get aware about freedom fighting and all. So, that is why they came up with Vernacular Press Act. What happened was, Amrita Bazar Patrika was one paper, it shifted from vernacular language to English newspaper. There were many newspapers who shifted from vernacular to English newspaper to avoid the Vernacular Press Act. Thereafter, no newspaper editor or owner dared to report against the company or British government, like the Hickey's Gazette, in order to avert any legal action. We all know that what happened to James Augustus Hickey. So, from that example, they started learning and they started not to publish against the company or the British government. So, we will keep it to this thing only, and I will see you in the next lecture with another topic. Namaskar.
स्वाध्यायः परमं तप